Hi, everybody. In my never-ending attempt to bring phenomenal guests on the show, I have yet another big fish on the show today, David Sloan Wilson. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great.
It's very nice to finally have you on the show. I need to apologize for taking this long to bring you on, but I guess you've been busy, I've been busy, so we finally found the right time to chat. For those of you who don't know David, let me just briefly mention some of his official bio. You are a distinguished professor of biological sciences and anthropology at Binghamton University, co-founder of the Evolution Institute, which perhaps we can talk about at some point. This is the idea that we should be introducing evolutionary thinking into, for example, public policy. Founder of the EVOS program at Binghamton University, something that I very much would like to talk about. You are the author of many books. I won't mention the papers because there are an endless number of papers, but let me just mention some of the books. On to Others, The Evolution and Psychology of Unselfish Behavior, Darwin's Cathedral, The Literary Animal. This is applying evolutionary thinking to literature. Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, The Neighborhood Project, Does Altruism Exist? And then your two latest books, which this might be where we start off. This View of Life. There you go. By the way, I plugged it a couple of SAAD truths ago. So I
Awesome.
and so this View of Life and Pro-Social, using evolutionary science to build productive, equitable, and collaborative. I'm missing the last word. Groups. Uh, Now, I should mention that you and I have known each other for many years. You were uh, incredibly gracious and kind to invite in 2005 a somewhat unknown, not unknown, but a somewhat unknown guy from Concordia University trying to apply evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior, trying to Darwinize the business school. So that was my first invitation to SUNY Binghamton in 2005. And then I came back in 2014. And then you came to Concordia in 2009 under the Science College. And so we've known each other both professionally and personally. So it is a truly great honor to have you on the show. Thank you for coming, David.
Well, thank you. You're a fellow traveler, and we're going to have a great time together.
I
Hopefully,
look
we'll something to disagree with.
I look forward to it. So maybe we could start off with your two latest books. How are they different from some of the ideas that you have promulgated in your other books?
Well, the idea of completing the Darwinian revolution and the fact that it's not complete, I think, is in some ways what I've been doing all along. And certainly, EVOS was a way to complete the Darwinian revolution in higher education by teaching evolution across the curriculum. I started that in 2003, just a few years before you came. And here we are, 2019. Where are we? And where we are is still at a point where the Darwinian revolution is complete within the biological sciences, but not for everything associated with the words human culture and policy. So the thesis of This View of Life is that until that famous phrase, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, extends to everything associated with human culture and policy, then the Darwinian revolution uh, is not yet complete. And especially when it comes to policy, it's not yet complete. The idea that nothing about policy makes sense except from an evolutionary perspective would be dumbfounding to most policy experts. So that's how far there is to go. And yet, there is a sizable community, as you well know because you're part of it, of and highly transdisciplinary community, basically a melting pot of all of the disciplines, which is in fact has completed the Darwinian revolution with many applications to public policy. So really, we're in a very exciting time, and I think that you might say a tipping point is possible, where this powerful theory, having already proven itself within the biological sciences, is now about to prove itself for all of the things that we concern us.
So
So
I
that's the. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so I guess that maybe one of the questions I was going to ask you later is from your vast experience, what are some of the reasons that cause people to reject evolution in general and evolutionary psychology in particular? So in a sense, that speaks to your goal to try to infuse public policy with the evolutionary lens. What is it that causes people to not realize that any study of any biological agent, including humans, must be informed via the evolutionary lens? Why is this not something trivially banal to accept?
Well, I actually think that there's not blame, but it's more of a two-way street than you might think. It's not as if like the evolutionists were enlightened and then there are all these benighted people that can't get it. Evolution itself, the study of evolution itself, became highly gene-centric during the 20th century. Darwin knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution was about variation, selection, and heredity, replication, any resemblance between offspring and their parents. But for complex reasons, with the discovery of Mendel's genes, then it was as if the only way for offspring to resemble their parents is by sharing genes, something that's manifestly false. And so the study of cultural change as an evolutionary process, and also personal change as an evolutionary process. The idea that each and every one of us, there's something about our behavior that is open-ended, not entirely scripted by our genes. Can we think of that as an evolutionary process? These, for the most part, got ceded to other disciplines. So evolution became gene-centric, had nothing to say about culture until about the 1970s, as you know, with people like Boyd and Richardson and so on. So there's that. And then, of course, those disciplines that did take culture as their province, cultural anthropology and sociology and so on, they became phobic about evolution in their own way. But I think it's that complex. And the question as to why it is that evolution became so gene-centric is an interesting one to ponder. Fast forward to the present. Many of my biological colleagues get sweaty palms when they try to think about humans. What they think about so easily for non-humans, they just don't want to go there. And so that apartheid is actually, to a large extent, respected on both sides. So there's an interesting point to make, basically.
Well, there's a term, actually, which you may or may not have heard of. I saw it in a book chapter. I can't remember the exact authors, but I think it's a great term. It's called the human reticence effect, which basically is the bias whereby perfectly reasonable people can accept that evolution explains the behavior of the salamander, the zebra, and all sorts of other taxa of animal, but somehow evolution doesn't apply to humans, or it can apply to humans, but as long as the evolutionary mechanisms stop at the neck, right? So it explains the evolution of my pancreas, but certainly it can't explain the evolution of what defines my personhood, which is my human mind. And I see this from otherwise very sophisticated thinkers, not just social scientists. I mean, you could have evolutionary biologists who are willing to use some evolutionary epistemology to explain the mating behavior of the salamander. But if I use the exact same epistemology to explain human mating, well, then I become some Nazi bullshitter who is engaging in pseudoscience. How do we get around this bias?
Well, I think that I'm just trying to choose our topic here, and we really should jump into evolutionary psychology, because I think
we shouldn't or should.
We should jump into evolutionary psychology, because I think it illustrates both the problem and the solution. On Twitter, one of your followers said, "Let's be sure to talk about the blank slate."
Right.
Because in some ways, I'm a defender of the blank slate. How can that be? And so let's spend a little bit of time on that. I've written a whole essay on that for a conference that was held last year, but it won't be out for a while. Here's the gist of it. Isn't it interesting that evolutionary biologists have their own blank slate assumption? Typically, the way that they operate is they assume that everything is heritable. And so when they ask questions about a species, they ask the question, what would the species be like if it were well adapted to its environment? That assumes that there was heritable variation for everything and time enough for natural selection to do its thing. And so therefore, that just made the organism a malleable clay, a blank slate that is molded to adapt to its environment. Now, evolutionists don't really think that. They easily back away from that assumption. They know that not everything is heritable, that there's constraints and all of that kind of stuff. But it's a great way to begin, basically, to assume that the organism is a blank slate. And then you look at the effect of natural selection, and then you go on from there. That's called adaptation thinking, natural selection thinking. It is the centerpiece of evolutionary thought. Now, the whole point of this view of life, and the whole point that we need to make, is that evolution goes beyond genetic evolution. We can think of cultural change as an evolutionary process, individual change as an evolutionary process, those being open-ended. In other words, a variation, selection, retention process. And to that extent, then the same blank slate gambit that we employ for the study of genetic evolution, we can employ for the study of cultural evolution and personal change. We can say cultures vary, and they get selected for stuff. We vary. We get selected for stuff. So not entirely. We back away from that assumption pretty easily. But to an extent, it's true, and that's the extent to which that acknowledgement of open-ended processes is perfectly legitimate, something we need to engage in.
Well, open-ended processes just mean that adaptability is itself an adaptation, right? We have behavioral flexibility, right? Plasticity. That's all you're saying. Yeah, that's it.
Totally.
But I think the confusion comes in regarding the guy who I guess wrote the Twitter thing about your, empty slate position, is that oftentimes the tabula rasa premise is associated with, radical social constructivism, right? Where you presume that people are born without any biological blueprints. And I'm assuming that you don't support that perspective, correct?
No, and what I think is the ideal analogy, not a metaphor, analogy, is with the immune system. The immune system is something we know well.
Exactly.
And it's often divided into two components called an innate component and an adaptive component. The innate component is just amazingly complex and highly modular, so many mechanisms that defend us against diseases that do not change during the lifetime of the organism. We're born with them and they do not change. Then there's the adaptive component, which is our capacity to create over 100 million different antibodies and amplify the ones that bind to antigens. That does change during our lifetimes. Your particular set of antibodies is something that evolved by an open-ended process, a variation and selection process during your lifetime. So you can't understand the immune system without acknowledging both an innate component and an adaptive component. Well, now let's think of our behavioral system as like that. Our behavioral system is even more challenging than our immune system. Our immune system just tackles diseases. Our behavioral system has to tackle diseases plus so much else. And so the idea that our behavioral system has a densely modular innate component, and that's what evolutionary psychologists such as Cosmides and Tooby appreciated, the massive modularity thesis. But what they didn't appreciate, and what they kind of cast away from evolutionary psychology, was the adaptive component, what they called social constructivism, what they call the standard social science model, should have been accepted as part of evolutionary psychology, analogous to the adaptive component of the immune system. That's certainly how Skinner talked about it. Skinner wrote a paper in 1981 called Selection by Consequences. And in that paper, he made a very simple claim. He said there's something about operant conditioning and open-ended cultural change that's like genetic evolution. Namely, if you want to predict how an organism is behaving, maybe you need to look at its history, not its genetic history, not even its cultural history, its reinforcement history during its lifetime, with amplified some of its behavior and tamped down others, just like the adaptive component of the immune system. So the one thing that we can see about these open-ended processes, individual change, cultural change, genetic evolution, is that there's selection by consequences. We predict the properties like top-down causation. You're familiar with these with these concepts. And why? So, and in retrospect, now that then this makes a world of sense. So when I've always had from the beginning a love-hate relationship with evolutionary psychology. Right down at the beginning, I hosted one of the first HBS meetings at Binghamton University in 1993. I don't know if you were there, but Cosmides and Tooby were.
No, I wasn't there.
They just published The Adapted Mind had just come out, and there's so much to love about it. And yet, when they made that polarizing move of saying, here's evolutionary psychology over here, and here's the standard social science model over there, I thought, oh man.
I mean, my reading. So let me just mention a few things. First, I'm glad you used the immune system as your example, because that's the exact example that I use when I talk about. Look, the immune system has to deal with rapidly mutating pathogens, and if it had no degrees of freedom, then we would all be dead by now. So I, of course, wholeheartedly agree with you. And I don't think, though, that Tooby and Cosmides, I don't want to speak for them, I don't think they reject the idea that there is behavioral plasticity as an adaptation, right? I mean, behavioral ecologists are in the business of doing that, right? They study cross-cultural differences as adaptive responses to local niches. So it's not as though evolutionists and even evolutionary psychologists don't recognize that we operate both in studying human universals, cross-cultural differences, and individual differences. I think what Tooby and Cosmides were doing was attacking the radical version of the SSSM model, which is to really reject the biologizing of human behavior. Isn't that really what they were trying to do?
Well, I think that, maybe not. They certainly acknowledged a role for transmitted culture, but had very little to say about it. Their main contribution was to talk about what they called invoked culture. And that's like a jukebox metaphor. So, wherever you are in the world, things happen, and that triggers genetically evolved modules. But I'm less concerned with like who said what than to operate in the current day. And there's been, as you know, a growing together of traditions. The evolutionary psychology tradition was quite separate from the cultural evolution tradition of Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson. If you go to the HBS meetings, you find that these things are kind of side by side, but a little bit like oil and water. But years pass and decades pass, and then we die.
But our memes survive. And
historians are going to look back upon it as a fast process. But to us, it's a slow process. But really, nowadays, if you think about terms such as the extended evolutionary synthesis, the term niche construction, that we're a niche constructing species. You hear about, so much that was attributed to genetic evolution and the idea of like a universal human nature. And I think evolutionary psychology did quite a bit buy into the idea that we're all the same species, we all have the same organs, individual differences, cultural variation is a little bit superficial. Now, the entire trend has been to accord more and more to cultural variation. Deep differences between culture. We've all heard the acronym WEIRD, white, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. And we thought that, weird people stand for all people.
Not white, Western.
Western, yes. Western. That weird people stand for all people. And now, remarkably, one of the most recent discoveries, I actually haven't read it yet, but it's been all over the Twitterverse, this study showing that weird culture actually emanates from Christian culture, which one of the things that Christianity did was it broke apart kin groups through its marriage norms and basically caused people to marry outside of their...
Oh, is this the paper that just came out in Science?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
right. I didn't read it yet, but I'm aware of it.
And that basically that resulted in a more atomistic psychology, because now, thanks to the rules of the church, individuals were marrying outside of their kin networks. They were dealing more with basically what the church did was it broke apart smaller cooperative units, family units, in order to create the larger cooperative unit, the church. And that paradoxically led to the current individualized culture and the society that comes with it. The entire concept of self. Language is now being studied much less like Chomsky and Pinker thought of it, as a genetic adaptation with a universal grammar, and much more so many independent efforts to communicate, so that the major languages now are actually no universal grammar. Just as with all forms of convergent evolution, they converge in the sense of functionally converge. They all have to allow communication to take place, but their grammars need not be the same. No universal grammar, and so on and on. We're according more and more to cultural differences as opposed to, and of course there is some underlying genetic human nature, although there's also quite a lot of genetic variation around the world.
Are you moving some papers or something around, because it's making a lot of static?
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yeah,
okay,
be careful that you don't do that, because it's affecting the sound quality. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah, go on.
So anyhow, these are some of the things that are taking place, that we have to find the measure of how much is due to cultural evolution, how much due to genetic evolution, and of course they co-evolve with each other.
Got it. I guess the debate that you're most famous for is the group, what used to be called group selection, now multi-level selection, where a wide range of famous evolutionists would disagree with you, starting with George Williams back in the 60s. But then, of course, you have more recently Jerry Coyne, Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, and others, all of whom say that there is no phenomenon that where you invoke group selectionism that can't be explained at a lower level of selection, the gene-centric view. Whereas, of course, you argue that no, there are phenomena that simply cannot be explained at the lower level. And E.O. Wilson in the last few years has come to your side of it. Now, the reason why I mention all these people is not to play the game of who is the most famous camp, but rather to speak actually to a confusion. I'll admit to this confusion, which is, this is one of the rare cases where I actually read material by either side. And as I read their position, I go, yeah, I buy that. And then I read the other side and I go, yeah, I kind of buy that. And so I'm kind of agnostic in that, while my reflex, having been sort of educated, if you'd like, in the traditional evolutionary psychology paradigm, is to have said it is settled, group selectionism is not needed. Through your work and that of others, it certainly has caused me to stop and think about it. Why do you think, for example, when you're comparing creationists to evolutionists, we can clearly say that there is a group of imbeciles and a group of people who know what they're talking about, with all due respect to the creationists. When it comes to this debate...
that was not with all due respect to the creationists. Don't call someone an imbecile and follow it with all due respect.
I'm Middle Eastern. I don't need to be as diplomatic as you. So on the other hand, when it comes to this debate, you have incredibly sophisticated thinkers on both sides that yet can't seem to convince one another to move 1 millimeter in their positions. What is it that is unique about this debate that causes, if nothing else, this wide confusion?
So I'll give several answers to that question, being mindful of the time, because we have lots of things to cover. So obviously we do want to cover this, but we don't want it to take over our broader conversation. And I think a broad answer has to do with the intellectual tradition of individualism, the idea that the individual person is some kind of the fundamental unit, and that everything social has to be understood in terms of individual action and agency. And as an intellectual tradition, this is something which became dominant in the middle of the 20th century, not just in biology, but across the board, economics, the social sciences, and in everyday life. So when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families, she was expressing this tradition that had become so dominant that it's the proverbial water that the fish can't see. And I think it's very, very interesting to think of the individualistic swing in evolutionary biology as part of this broader cultural trend. So it was in the 1960s that George Williams came up with his theory of individual level selection, and then that became the basis for Dawkins's selfish gene. It was at that time that John Maynard Smith developed evolutionary game theory, emulating economic game theory. And at that time, I was there. I was a graduate student. There was so much excitement because people like Maynard Smith were saying, oh my heavens, evolutionary theory is converging with economic theory. I mean, the economists talk about individuals maximizing their utility, and we talk about individuals maximizing their individual fitness. There's only this one small differences, and it seemed so very general, but in fact it was so very provincial. There was a convergence on this idea that the individual is the self-interested entity, and the power of seeing everything through that lens. And so I think that now what did individualism replace? It replaced something called functionalism, associated with figures such as Emile Durkheim and Talcott Parsons and Weber, and these folks thought of society as something that existed in its own right, that when you study a culture or society, you study its feature as being good for the whole culture. For example, the concept of society as an organism used to be conventional back then, and it was criticized in part for being too axiomatic, as if every feature of every culture had to be good for the group, and didn't really have a story about how these cultures came into existence. It wasn't very evolutionary that way. It didn't provide much scope for individual agency, and so for good reasons, functionalism was critiqued. Then it was replaced by individualism, which we can now see in retrospect is also axiomatic, as if every feature of every society can be explained somehow in terms of individual or genetic self-interest. So one axiomatic worldview replaced another, and I think the real import of multi-level selection is that we don't have to be axiomatic anymore. There is a logic for saying that in a multi-tier and everything from societies and ecosystems to molecules, there's a privileged unit of analysis, and that is the functionally organized unit. If a unit is functionally organized to survive and reproduce, that influences the way we study everything below that unit as contributing to its design, and it influences the way we study everything above that unit, how that unit functions in a population or an ecosystem as a self-interested entity. So the population and the ecosystem is not itself functionally designed. It's just a collection of self-interested agents. So the identification of the functionally organized unit is something that's absolutely the way we should be proceeding, but there's not a single answer to that question. Sometimes that functionally organized unit is what we recognize as the individual organism, but sometimes it's the social group, as with a social insect colony. Or actually, sometimes it's something within the organism, such as a cancer, then becomes the functionally organized unit, and the organism just becomes a collection of cells that the cancer is spreading within. And so what multi-level selection is something that enables you to determine the unit of functional organization on a case-by-case basis That's the real import of multi-level selection theory.
But what I mean, so if I look at it from a psychology of scientific persuasion perspective, so let me, if I could just kind of step back a sec and give a little bit of an intro. So in operations research, which is an applied mathematics field, you have, let's say, a problem that you're trying to maximize or minimize. You're optimizing some objective function. So let's say the two-dimensional cutting stock problem. Sorry, something came up on my screen. Let me just shut it down. Okay. So the two-dimensional cutting stock problem is basically the idea that if you've got these rectangular sheets of metal or wood or glass, and you're trying to try to find the best way to satisfy an order. I want 10 X by Y rectangles and 20. How should I cut these so I minimize the waste of the original sheet? Okay. And when you're trying to solve this, there are several ways by which you can decide whether you have the right solution. One of which is you take accepted problems that different lab groups are working on, and that this group says, well, we found an algorithm that yields 4.3% waste. And this group beat it. They found an algorithm that has 3.2% waste. So that's one way to get, quote, at a scientific, trying to resolve a debate in operations research. More recently, I talk about nomological networks of cumulative evidence, something that the original guy to do it was Charles Darwin, although he didn't call it that, right? This is the idea of bringing, in trying to persuade someone of the veracity of your theory, you look for as many different sources of distinct lines of evidence that support your position. And of course, that's what Darwin did in Origin of Species. So David Schmidt, former student of David Buss, and Pilcher had a paper in Psychological Science where they talked about these nomological networks. Independently, I was doing the same thing in my own work, where because I was trying to infuse evolutionary thinking into an otherwise very hostile audience in the business school, in the social sciences, I developed my own independent way of coming up with these nomological networks of cumulative evidence. So for example, and I'm going to come in a second to multi-level selection, so bear with me. So if I'm trying to demonstrate to you that toy preferences have a sex specificity that is not due to social construction, then I'm going to think to myself, well, what would be the evidence that I need to accumulate to convince you of that position? So I might get evidence from developmental psychology, from clinical pediatric endocrinology, from comparative psychology, showing that other primates have the same sex specificity, and so on. So bit by bit, I build such a tsunami of evidence that it becomes very difficult for you to counter my position. If you can, good for you, but otherwise I'm going to drown you in a tsunami of evidence. Now I'm going to link it to what we're talking about. Is there a way to epistemologically build something akin to a nomological network of cumulative evidence that demonstrates that under these particular conditions for these particular phenomena, it has to be multi-level selection? Because again, when I read both positions, I am lost in the endless intricate trees and technical details without being able to step back and say, look, David Sloan Wilson has just showed here are 73 phenomena that could never be explained by a gene-centric view. Is there a way to address what I'm saying, or has it been done and I missed it?
Well, in a sense, it has been done, God. And whether you missed it, I don't know. But the reason that it's not common knowledge is because of this concept of equivalence, the idea that there's different ways of accounting for the same thing, okay? That they look different, but they're really like the proverbial group of people in a dark room groping an elephant, a metaphor with so much humor potential. Increasingly when I write about this, I'm saying, what do all theories of social evolution share in common? What do they all share in common? And there's a core set which includes the following. Social interactions almost always take place in groups that are small compared to the total evolving population. Name me a social interaction, and then I will show you that it takes place among a relatively small number of individuals. When you're being altruistic, you're influencing some small set of other individuals. So that means that all evolving populations or populations of groups in addition to populations of individuals. To be pro-social, to benefit others or one's group as a whole, requires time, energy, and risk on the part of the individual. That's just a fact of life. It's based on trade-offs. I can't help you without exerting some energy, time, and a degree of risk. I can't do it, even if I open a door for you. Even if I point something out to you, that requires a little something on my part that places me at a disadvantage compared to a more self-serving individual in my immediate vicinity. And so that leads to a selective disadvantage for pro-social behaviors at the smallest scale of individuals interacting within groups. Show me any model of social evolution, call it game theory, call it inclusive fitness, call it selfish gene theory. You cannot get away from those assumptions. And so therefore, if natural selection is weighing against pro-social behaviors at the smallest scale, how can we get it to evolve? All you have to do is to go up to a slightly larger scale of the groups interacting with other groups. For example, let's take the famous tit-for-tat strategy.
This is the Axelrod, the game.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So game theory is called N-person game theory. N, what does N stand for? It's the number of individuals that are socially interacting with each other. The smallest value N can take is 2. Now our individuals are interacting in dyads. Tit-for-tat starts nice and then copies the behavior of its partner. All defect starts nasty and stays nasty. So now we imagine the groups of size 2, tit-for-tat and an all defect, interacting with each other. First round, all defect wins. Second round, they just tie for the second, third, fourth, and fifth round because tit-for-tat learned from its experience. The net effect, a small advantage for all defect because it won the first time around and everything else was even after that. So all defect beats tit-for-tat in every mixed pairing. How can tit-for-tat evolve? Well, tit-for-tat finds itself with other tit-for-tats in other pairings. They do well. And all defect finds itself with other all defects in other pairings in which it does poorly. But you have to go to the level of the pair, which is the group, in order to find the advantage of tit-for-tat. And the inventor of tit-for-tat, Anatole Rappaport, in Axelrod's famous computer simulation tournament, actually thought of it that way. But what game theory does is it averages the fitness of the individual strategies across pairings, and it comes to the conclusion that under certain circumstances, tit-for-tat is more fit on average, all things considered, than all defects. And so therefore, it's easy to say that it evolves by individual level selection. Well, that's not the same as within pair selection, but nevertheless, it allows you to think about tit-for-tat as an individually selfish strategy. So what we see here in game theory is the entire logic of multi-level selection. Negative selection within groups, positive selection between groups is present in game theory, but it gets rendered as an individualistic.
This is your averaging fallacy story?
This is what's called the averaging fallacy, and it's been articulated. It's not hard to understand. We just did it. And
so then how do you explain that, again, as a psychologist, then if I'm charitable to your position and I say, well, okay, I'm with you, then how do you explain, and I'm not asking you to try to put yourself in the minds of others, but how do you explain that all of these sophisticated thinkers are unable to simply see your insight?
Well, all of these sophisticated thinkers can be counted on almost one hand. They include...
then there's John Tooby.
What's that?
John Tooby.
I haven't heard from him in a long time. And these are people that actually... here's another gripe, okay?
Sure, go for it. It's the gripe show.
It's the gripe show. Why is it that the intelligent reading public can only fastens onto such a small number of people and treats them as intellectual giants that are wise on anything, any and all topics. I mean, you know that scientific inquiry involves many dozens and dozens of smart people that contribute to the peer review literature. And the idea that Richard Dawkins and Edward O. Wilson and Steve Pinker are some kind of giants walking among the Lilliputians, well, come on. And Jerry Coyne is really good on the topic of speciation. Steve Pinker is really good on a bunch of topics associated with language and cognition and stuff like that. Richard Dawkins hasn't been contributing to the peer review literature for decades. And so why these people are treated as oracles that are capable of holding forth on all topics, I don't know. But the fact is, they haven't contributed, in many cases, a single article to the peer-reviewed literature on multi-level selection. And yet, because they have these big reputations, when they say something, it's just like a shameless example of prestige bias. The famous person says something, and then it's accepted as gospel by the rank and file.
But then E.O. Wilson, who is arguably the most famous of all the people that you've mentioned, is come on your side. So it's not as though all of the so-called oracles are in the opposite camp, right? So
No, indeed. And so I appeal to people to read, first of all, to get the concept of equivalence. And by the way, even Ed Wilson doesn't really get the concept of equivalence. I've criticized him as well. What you should be saying is that if you like inclusive fitness theory, be my guest, but just be bilingual about it. Don't say that inclusive fitness theory is an alternative to group selection theory. Just be capable of making the translation, as I just did. And Ed is not very good at that. Ed and Martin Nowak.
Right.
And there's a whole. I mean, it gets more complicated than this, Scott. And if I could just, if the listeners to this podcast want a deeper dive, then I did a long conversation with a real expert in this area named Jonathan Birch. And on this View of Life, the Evolution Institute's online magazine, there's this conversation is titled Master Class, a conversation with Jonathan Birch. Just type that into Google. You'll get to this article. And then it goes through this in gory detail as to this whole, and why it is that experts, including Jonathan Birch and myself, will agree on a big zone of agreement and then a very interesting zone of disagreement on topics such as, what do we mean by a group? Are we going to have a definition of groups that's really permissive or a definition of groups that's more restrictive? So there is an expert conversation that's taking place, which is just great. And so the task is to get the larger public to this level of literacy.
Is there a sense, so for example, in the climate change conversation, you often hear people quoting the 97% of climate scientists agree. I kind of dislike this approach because, of course, science is not about popularity contest. Exactly, it's not consensus and so on. But it might be informative to, as one navigates through the group selection versus not debate, what is the extent to which, let's call them evolutionary behavioral scientists rather than evolutionary psychologists, meaning covering the whole panoply of evolutionary fields that study behavior. What is, in your best estimate, the percentage of people who are on the side of accepting multi-level selection theory versus being doggedly against it? Do you have a sense of that number?
Yeah, there's a total sea change. When I was a grad student at the beginning of all of this, it was almost mandatory for the author of an article to say that what they were presenting, whether it was a theoretical model or an empirical study, did not invoke group selection. That was almost mandatory.
This is kind of the consequence of the George Williams book, right?
Yep, this is a consequence of the George Williams book. There's an anecdote that I report in under others of a young associate of mine, a graduate student, who was given this advice by a very famous person whose name I won't mention. There's three things you do not mention in biology: Lamarckism, the phlogiston theory, and group selection. That's how dead group selection was. Now it is almost mandatory for the author of a peer-reviewed article to acknowledge equivalence. The idea that these alternative theories that go by different names, such as inclusive fitness theory and multilevel selection theory, are different ways of accounting for the same processes, so that they're like speaking different languages. If I speak French and you speak English, and I tell you that your language is stupid and confusing, well, that's just bad on me. We just need to be bilingual. So that is what's like almost mandatory in a peer review articles. And yes, there are a few people for whom the adage, science progresses funeral by funeral, holds. That's happened in the past, and it's happening now. So Richard Dawkins will go to his grave without changing
his mind.
All
right. Well, I'm mindful of the time, so I want to move on beyond the group selectionism thing. Let's talk briefly about religion. Of course, you've written the book Darwin's Cathedral, where you invoke group selectionism to explain the adaptive value of religiosity. So my question to you would be the following. And actually, I said yesterday in my MBA class that I would ask you this question because I was talking about cultural products, of which religion is one manifestation. Do you think that if an idea confers a benefit to an individual or to a group, so in your argument, it confers adaptive value to the group, but I could say that being religious allows me to deal with issues that otherwise would have been impossible for me to deal with had I not been religious. So think about sort of the Pascal's wager type of argument. As a purist, so let me first show my cards. As a purist, I would argue that if I think that an idea is false but confers benefits, as a purist, I don't accept it. What's your position on this? If I can prove to you, so I don't know what your religious views are, but if I say to you, religion is a false belief system that nonetheless confers benefits to individuals or groups, is it worthwhile to keep it, or as a seeker of truth, I should reject it?
Right. Okay. So here's we can get through this. We're good here. How much do we have? Only 9 more minutes for that conversation.
No. You said till 11:45 you have to stop, so we have about 20 minutes.
Okay. Good. So this is such a deep topic, and let's begin with the concept of symbolic thought, something which is actually turning out to be very distinctively human, maybe even uniquely human. Why? Because it's a form of intense cooperation. And the one thing that distinguishes our species certainly from chimps, our closest ancestors, and from actually most other primate species, even most other social species, it's a shock for many people who are not biologists to realize how many social species are just like horrible and despotic from a human perspective. There's a little bit of cooperation, and there's a lot of antagonism among members of single groups as they strive for dominance and so on and so forth. They kill each other's babies.
Lions.
They impose suffering on each other. All forms of within-group selection, disruptive within-group selection. So, and there's also a degree of cooperation that evolves between-group selection. It's like a mixed bag. But in humans, what took place was what's called a major evolutionary transitions, mechanisms that enabled members of groups to suppress each other's self-serving tendencies, mostly through punishment. And Richard Wrangham's most recent book, The Goodness Paradox, is all about the self-domestication, basically. And that enabled all forms of cooperation to take place, not just physical cooperation, but mental cooperation. And so there was a renaissance, an inflorescence of the capacity to communicate in terms of symbols. And so what that means is just as we have a collection of, every individual has a collection of genes which in part determines the way they are. That's a genotype-phenotype relationship. Every human has a collection of symbols that in part determines who they are. Let's call that a symbotype-phenotype relationship. And so that's what dual inheritance theory is. Two streams of inheritance, a symbolic stream and a genetic stream. The symbolic stream arose by genetic evolution, but then it became an evolutionary, an inheritance system in its own right. And then those two streams of inheritance have been co-evolving with each other for our entire history of a species. And it's very often the case that the slow process of genetic evolution follows where the fast process of cultural evolution leads. So first we adapt to our environments culturally by individual learning and cultural transmission, and then that reconfigures the genetic selection pressures so that genetic evolution more or less adapts us to the environments that we construct for ourselves.
That's the lactose intolerant argument.
And the lactose intolerance is the perfect example of that. First, we domesticate livestock, and then we genetically develop the ability to digest lactose. And there's many, many examples of that. So against that background, all of us have meaning systems, symbolic systems, or we can't function without them, which might or might not count as religious or not. You might or might not be religious, but you certainly do have some collection of symbols in your head that organize your experience and ultimately figure out how you act. Okay, now, if we look at any meaning system and think of religion as a subset of meaning systems, that's an extremely important move. We should not be studying religions. We should be studying meaning systems and then various types of meaning systems. And then we look at beliefs within a meaning system that count as factually correct, scientifically accurate, or not. And then we ask the question, what is the role of fictions, adaptive fictions, in meaning systems? Why is it that we believe in stuff that's not out there? Is it just some kind of stupid quirk? Or is there a sense in which, at least historically, most meaning systems, in order to organize our experience and motivate actions, made abundant use of stuff that's not out there, things that are within the meaning system? They don't correspond to what's out there, but their connection to reality is how they cause us to behave in the real world. And then you can see that at least in the past, leading up to the present, all meaning systems, regardless of whether they appear to us as religious or not, are chock full of adaptive fictions. All kinds of departures from it. They must, in some sense, in order to function.
If I could, sorry to interrupt you. Forgive me for interrupting you, just so I can kind of direct the conversation a bit. I mean, your eloquent response was a response to my original question, which is, does it make sense to believe in something if it has some functional benefit or adaptive benefit, even though I think it's false? And your response to me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you'll correct me, it's almost a new variant of the accommodationist perspective of someone like Stephen Jay Gould, whereby, I mean, in his case, he's saying, hey, NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, science and religion can get along. And you're somehow being a bit of an apologist for, hey, there is value in religion, whether we think it's true or not. But again, my mother once told me when I was about, I don't remember how old, maybe 8 or 9 years old, she looked at me and she said, Gad, the world doesn't abide by your purity bubble. The world is made up of it, right? So stop being so pure. It won't do you well in life. Regrettably, I didn't listen to her good advice. And I've gone on my life living with a very sort of principled, exacting principle of purity. So to me, if I think that a belief system is false, I outgrow it, irrespective of whether in some past or some present it confers to me some functional benefit. It is false. Therefore, as a truth seeker, I reject it. Do you think that I'm being too dogmatic in my approach? Do you think that if religion has some value, then we should, play the game even though it may be false? And it's a simple question.
Well, I want to stake out our common ground
Yeah.
first, our zone of agreement first. The meaning system that both of us want to work towards, the meaning system most worth wanting, needs to be fully respectful of factual reality, basically a science-based meaning system. Now, science by itself only tells us what is, not how to act. So science needs to be supplemented with values in order to become a meaning system. To think otherwise is the famous naturalistic fallacy. So yes, I think that we need to work towards a meaning system which is in the first place highly motivating, gets us out of bed brimming with purpose, and then instructs us how to act for the benefit of the whole world. And in order to do that is going to be very much based on science. And so that's the meaning system of the future that we want to work towards. When we examine the meaning systems of the present and the past, we need to realize that they are not like that for some very good reasons. And furthermore, we have to realize that if you think that religions are the only meaning systems that depart from factual reality, I have something to tell you.
Right, sure.
And there's an amazing book that illustrates this called The Invention of Tradition. And what it shows is that what people believe about their own people and their own past is just as important as any gods that they might.
Well, all you're saying is that people could be parasitized, as I explained in my forthcoming book, by many different strains of idea pathogens. One of which, though, is religion. One
of which is religion, but one reason why I am somewhat of a fierce critic of the so-called new atheists,
right,
is that they depart from factual reality in their own way in their beliefs about religion.
How so?
They cannot, and just look at, for example, the conversation that Richard Dawkins had with Brett Weinstein that is available on the internet. And Weinstein, who might disagree with me on group selection, we don't really know because we haven't had that conversation, tried to get Dawkins to acknowledge the fact that most enduring religions are cultural adaptations. They exist on this earth because they create strong cooperative communities. But Dawkins could not bring himself to say that. For Dawkins, the only way that he can understand religions is some kind of mind virus, mind parasite, bad for individuals, bad for groups, like a parasite. That's a theoretical possibility, but it ain't true. And there's plenty of scholarship during the last 20 years following upon Darwin's Cathedral and the other books that started to appear to that. There's the consensus among people that study religions from an evolutionary perspective that most enduring religions are group-level adaptations, which is basically the thesis of Darwin's Cathedral. Dawkins just can't go there. He can't go there. And so that makes him basically blind to the very nature of religion. He has to think of it as evil. And so there's an example of false beliefs, basically, about what we know about religion.
But see, I see it more. I mean, it's an accounting system. So in the ledger, I put the pros and the cons. I would readily concede that there are many benefits, as I stated earlier, for being religious, both at the individual level and in sort of the adaptive position that you take. And so, to be different from Richard Dawkins, I concede that that's true. But I also would proclaim that his analysis of it being a mind virus, I mean, there is an endless number of things that religion brings about that are terrible. I can't remember the exact quote by the physicist, the Nobel Prize physicist, who said, only only religion can make good people do bad things, or I don't remember the exact quote. As someone who left the Middle East under imminent threat of execution, I wasn't running away from MAGA wearing Trump supporters. I was running away from people who were very committed religiously to exterminate people who came from my religion. And at that point, I couldn't hide under the protective shield of Darwin's cathedral and group selectionism of adaptive arguments, right? I was running for my life because religion does parasitize human minds. So again, I think that Dawkins is wrong not to recognize the point that you're making, but it is also incorrect to proclaim that, oh, it is one of one meaning systems and there are other false beliefs. Religion is something that I'd like to think we can outgrow. Although, by the way, I don't think we'll ever outgrow it, because I think that it is part of human nature to be religious, precisely because we have the prefrontal cortex to recognize our mortality, to recognize that horrible things can happen to us randomly. And the only pill that we can take to, quote, solve that problem is to be religious. So while I am staunchly anti-religious, I recognize that we will never eradicate it. So what does that make me? Does that make me a new atheist, or does that make me a regular vanilla atheist?
I think that what you're attributing to religion has to be attributed to multi-level selection. What multi-level selection tells us is that competition at any level, such as the between group level, is disruptive. Within group cooperation and between group competition are joined at the hip. And Peter Turchin's book, Ultra Society, explains this well. So, I mean, in the animal world, there's all kinds of destructive competition among groups, such as social insect colonies fighting each other. So we have not only the destructive effects of between-group competition, but the within-group destructive effects of what Michelle Gelfand calls tight cultures in her book on tight and loose cultures. Any tight culture, which is basically organized, designed to create solidarity within the group, is going to be imposing harsh sanctions on its own members, brutal, harsh sanctions on its own members, in order to forge them into a solid unit in competition with other groups. There's so many examples of that taking place outside of religion, that what we're attributing to religion, we should be attributing to this process of multi-level selection. And knowing that, it's against that background, by the way, that if you look at the emergence of the major religious traditions, such as Christianity and Buddhism, I just had a conversation with the Dalai Lama a couple of weeks ago. In preparation for that, I read the history of Tibet. One of incessant between-group conflict at various scales. It could be the small scale of clans warring with other clans, or it could be at the large scale of the Chinese Empire warring with other empires. You're never getting away from between-group conflict. All you're doing is monkeying with the scale. And what the advent of the major religions did, such as Buddhism and Christianity, was they increased the scale of between-group competition. They provided a glue for cooperative society to hang together at a much larger scale than before. That was the good news, but always in competition with some other group. And so you're never eliminating conflict. You're only elevating it to a larger scale where it can take place with even more destructive force than before. That's the big picture.
So then
to attribute that to religion is profoundly untrue.
So then you would support the position of Scott Atran, where he says that people join ISIS not at all for any religious-based beliefs, but rather it's for male bonding and sensation-seeking. You're into that model?
Well, what Atran says, God, is a sense of meaning.
Right.
Not male bonding, not sensation-seeking, a deep sense of meaning. That's why a suburban kid who just doesn't know, in a materialistic culture, could actually do something like that, because it gives them some sense of a deep purpose in life. So there is
that deep purpose is being invoked by religion in this case, right? It's not
In this
because
case, it is.
right,
In this
okay.
case, it is.
Got it.
And what Atram says is, let's find ways to create groups with a deep purpose in life that are more pro-social.
Right. We don't have much time, only 2 minutes, and I only got, I think, through about 20% of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. So we'll have to do this again at some point. Are there any other than, of course, and I'm sorry to end it abruptly because I want to be very mindful of your next meeting, which is in a few minutes. Are there any other projects other than the two books that we mentioned that just came out that you might want to use this platform to promote before we sign off for today?
Well, it's very much a continuation of what we've just said. The practical matter is that we need to have a technique for working with to basically manage cultural evolution at all scales, from individuals to small groups to the planet. Because cultural evolution will take place unless we manage it. It will go where we don't want it to go. And so the idea that we need to be wise managers of evolutionary processes is basically what needs to take place. And in my newest book with Paul Atkins and Steve Hayes, we've developed a practical framework for working with groups of all sorts to make them more pro-social internally and in their interactions with other groups. So to build up from the micro level, which is not the individual, it's the small group, to the mesoscale, cultural multi-level, multiple group cultural ecosystems, and to the macro scale, basically the welfare of the whole earth. So what's so important is to move this from the intellectual plane to the plane of actually doing things in groups to create strong cells, and then those cells creating multicellular, large-scale society. That's the practical project, and that's what I'm most passionate about in all of my work. And so go to prosocial.world, and you'll get to our website, or my newest book with Paul and Steve, Prosocial, is really the beginning of a how-to manual for putting all of this into action. And that's an endeavor in which we welcome groups of all kinds, including religious groups and secular groups. And what we find is that this is such a positive process that we get along very well with religious groups. There's something about this which is in some sense religious and spiritual, not in the sense that it requires belief in supernatural agents, but in what it's trying to do in terms of becoming a part of something positive that's larger than ourselves, something that's transformative. The future can be different than the past. All of these are part of the religious impulse. And let me just end, God, I'm cutting into my own time, but let me just end. It's so fascinating that there's not one, but two major definitions of religion that are completely different from each other. One definition has to do with belief in supernatural agency. The other definition is by Durkheim, who said religion is a collection of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, the concept of the sacred that unite into one single moral community, all who adhere to them. And so Durkheim's definition of religion doesn't say a word about supernatural agency. It does say something about the concept of the sacred. And the idea that the concept of the sacred can have a perfectly sensible secular formulation, atheistic formulation, in addition to a religious formulation. In both cases, it involves holding something in such high regard that we obey its dictates. We willingly subordinate ourselves to something that's higher than ourselves. That could be the welfare of the whole earth, need not invoke any supernatural agency. So I think that what we need to do is we need to rely upon Durkheim's definition of religion. We need to hold the welfare of the earth as sacred, and then we have to work towards that goal at all scales, from small groups on up.
Well, it is my sacred pleasure to have had you on the show. Please stay on offline so I could say goodbye when I turn off the camera. Thank you so much, David, for joining, and I look forward to next chat at some point soon.
Okay, take care.
Cheers.